Hello and welcome to episode 165 of the Half Point Per Podcast. I'm your host, Evan Riggs, joined as always by my co-host, Dalton Willie, and no producer Johnny Pham. We do have spectator Chloe Riggs over my shoulder right here taking Johnny's place. Dalton, I don't think Johnny heard the last episode of the show as we predicted, so no New York trip. It does not appear for you.
That's tough for Johnny. I tried for him. He could have me in New York, but it's his own fault. It's on you, Jonathan.
I kind of maybe we'll figure it out as we go. I kind of want to figure out because I don't know how many episodes Johnny's gonna miss. What's the deal with the PC? If it's fixed, if it's not, or whatever. See if we can work in a little breadcrumb for Johnny and see how many consecutive episodes he doesn't listen to the podcast while he's not on it. Oh man,
we can get this going for a while.
Yeah, I think we could probably make it for the entirety of when he's off, depending on how long that is. But we've got a fun one today, Dalton. Of course, the fantasy semifinals. Apologies for not being able to get you guys any kind of show, stream, or podcast last week. Just was not possible. And let me tell you, the NFL is making it really difficult for us to give you something next week because we have Monday night games, we have Christmas Eve, and then we have championship week starts on Christmas Day. But we will try to find a way for maybe an abbreviated pod, just a little start sit. And we haven't talked about this, but I was thinking maybe top 12 show during week 18 because nobody that listens to this show, I hope, is playing week 18 playoffs. So I'm looking forward to finally talking some top 12 because I've been seeing people doing top 12s for the last month, and I think I've got some takes. I'm ready to get off on that.
Yeah, I actually have Jeremiah Smith as number 11. I know he's not going to be in the league for 2 or 3 more years, but it's better to get out ahead of these things so drafters know where they should draft them.
Oh, that does remind me today. Dalton sent a very funny tweet, and it's not even funny necessarily. That Underdog tweeted it. It's more funny to me that it seems like people in the replies actually still need to see this tweet. It's about DeAndre Swift, and it's just the split. We all know he started off great, was like a top 5 running back. For the last half of the season, he's been I think it's like outside of the top 30, something like that. The splits are that sharp, and this really did feel like this is the ultimate. That it might work for us. So let's just, DeAndre Swift, hot start, sell high, draft him for that reason. It might work for us.
Well, did it work for those people?
No, it never does. I mean, these people somehow delude themselves into thinking it might, but it might work for us.
Have you ever watched Arrested Development? I feel like we've had this conversation.
I haven't. I tried once and I didn't sit down and watch it long enough. It looks really good, at least the first couple seasons.
Yeah, so once you'll know. I think it's the first 3 seasons because the 4th is a Netflix special, and the 5th I don't remember if it was a Netflix special or just after that. But the 4th season was so bad they had to actually go back into Netflix and reorder the episodes because it was so confusing, which I've never heard of a show doing that. And I mean, Arrested Development is kind of like, I don't know, like Seinfeld or more Friends maybe than Seinfeld, but like Friends or just other sitcoms like that where you don't really have to watch them in order, but there is kind of an underlying story as you go, but they also work standalone. But yeah, to have to reorder the show that is like that is truly a special feat. But the first 3 seasons are some of my favorite in television period. So you should definitely give it another chance.
Well, it's good for everybody with DeAndre Swift. I do think next year is his year for 8 weeks. And then you should probably trade him again and not draft him as a top 24 running back if we've learned anything.
The problem is I don't think anybody's actually because the tweet ended with like the ultimate sell high ? Which I mean, at this point, I mean, you can't sell. So I guess it's just a statement like he was the ultimate sell high. It's like, yeah, everybody knows that every year, which means he's not a sell high. You're selling him and you're getting back what people are projecting is going to happen because it happens every single year. And let's move on that note, Dalton, to talking about the fantasy semifinals. And where we can start is just talking through some of these streaming running backs, or I guess waiver wire running backs, because there's a lot of guys out that potentially were out there in leagues, or you could have gotten within the last couple of weeks, who are all of a sudden kind of in spots where I think they're borderline starts. And where we're going to start is in Cleveland. And this guy I don't think is borderline, but we can talk about it. And that's Jerome Ford. Obviously, Nick Chubb breaks his foot, which just on a human level is very sad. No player outside of the Chiefs and players on my own fantasy team I'm rooting for harder than Nick Chubb, and he just has not been able to catch a break the last couple of years. But in comes Jerome Ford, has a big run, scores touchdown, something like 17 points in the last 2 quarters of that game. I mean, is he viable to start in the semifinals this week with, I'm not going to say the backfield to himself, but he will be the lead guy in this backfield?
It's rough for a couple of reasons. The conversion to DTR, I mean, it's killed the entire fantasy outlook of that offense. Jameis, if anything, is a fantasy merchant.
So real quick, have we seen? Last I saw from Stefanski, it was going to be a week-to-week decision, sort of deal. So, do we have any further clarity as to maybe if it's going to be DTR this week?
DTR was announced as the starter for this week, I do believe. And that, I mean, it craters the fantasy outlook of that offense. You're in a hard spot. If you're in the semis, you probably have 2 starting running backs. And if you don't, congratulations. Where I can see this being an issue is if you had David Montgomery, and this does become one of the premier streaming options, in my opinion. It's not going to be pretty with DTR in most cases, because we've seen him enough that we know he's not really a competent NFL quarterback, but it seems like they just care about getting another look at him to see whether or not he could be somebody they keep on their roster next season, which is what I think the Cleveland Browns are doing. They've made their decision that Jameis isn't going to be their guy next year. And in that sense, yes, you can start him. He's going to probably get some good checkdowns, and you're hoping that he does what he did last week and break a long run, but he should not be started over like the top 24 running backs in almost any case. So there are guys even that are in split backfields that are probably worth a better start or a better look at than he is at this point.
I'm going to have to pull up some ranks here, but I would have him just inside my top 24 if I were doing ranks this week. And I mean, you said it. I know if it's DTR, it's probably not going to be the best fantasy environment, but I think he is going to get such volume. He showed his explosiveness. I just think he's a guy that I have a hard time getting outside my top 24. Partially, like, it gets real grim. It gets real grim at running back as you go. Like, here, I'll mute my mic.
I'm looking at it right now. It is really grim. So, expert consensus on Fantasy Pros has Jerome Ford at RB20, right above Breece Hall, Tony Pollard, Rashad White, DeAndre Swift, and Ramondre Stevenson and Isaiah Pacheco. So there are some names in there that I would start over Jerome Ford and some names I wouldn't start. I'm assuming there's injury news that I haven't caught up on Breece Hall for him being ranked this low, or ECR is on crack right now.
No, but I think, and I'll give it a look. I just think it may just be, we don't even know if he's playing for sure yet. That could be a placeholder.
But like one player, I like talking about split backfields, I would start Rashad White over Jerome Ford. Since week 9, when he came back from injury, he's averaging 75 yards a game. He's also averaging 12.8 touches per game, and he's had 9 touchdowns. He's reasserted himself as a force in that backfield alongside Bucky Irving. He's not RB1 status like he was being drafted early on, but he's certainly a player I would more rely on, especially with the way the Cleveland offense is moving. I would pick Jerome Ford over Tony Pollard if you're in that. and we'll talk more about Pollard's situation, I would start Jerome Ford over DeAndre Swift. I would probably start Pacheco and Stevenson over Ford, though.
So I'm looking. It looks like Breece Hall was not on the injury report.
That's insane. I would definitely start Breece Hall.
He has been all week. I think today
Okay.
he's finally off the injury report. So I'm assuming that rank will adjust, especially because Braylon Allen is actually on the injury report with a back injury. So is Isaiah Davis, who got a shocking amount of touches in what I saw last week for the Jets. But yeah, I think we're pretty close on Jerome Ford. Tajay Spears. So obviously a guy that we loved preseason was banged up when he was in there, just was not getting the run that we hoped. Tony Pollard gets banged up last week, and Tajay Spears plays a season-high 55% of the snaps because, of course, he does. However, I think as long as Tony Pollard is active, which as of right now, it seems like he probably will be, I just don't think you can toss Tajay Spears into your starting lineup. I mean, yes, he did play 55% of the snaps, and part of that was because Pollard exited the game for a little bit. But even then, he only had 15% of the team's rush attempts last week. And he did have 17% of the targets, which was a season high. But I don't know how you can take that and really he scored a touchdown and he played a lot, but he just didn't get a lot of volume still. I don't know how you can take that and trust it in your semifinals if Tony Pollard's out there this week. If Pollard's somehow not out there, which I don't expect, but if that were to happen, then yeah, I'm totally good with firing up Tajay Spears and going down with the ship if that were to happen.
Yeah, Chloe's on the move. I first of all, I'm in a position right now in my semifinals of my dynasty league where Tajay Spears is in consideration for getting a start because I've been flexing Jonnu Smith and starting Travis Kelce. It's worked, but my point on Tajay Spears is I wouldn't really trust him. He looked great. He looks like what we talked about all offseason. If you watch on one of his catches, he does like a 3-step juke on BJ Hill when he catches the ball, and it was really impressive and it was really cool to see. And
all the clips were great. Like that touchdown was one of the coolest touchdowns I've ever seen.
Now, if Tony Pollard isn't a go, which it seems like he's going to be, he's definitely not a start. He definitely is a start. But Tajay Spears is not somebody I'm going to be putting in my lineup unless I'm in desperation mode. And even then, you're relying on a Mason Rudolph-led offense to get you to your playoff finals. I don't really like the look of that.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about the Mason.
They do
Rudolph.
play Indy, who's one of the worst run defenses for what it's worth.
Yep, they do. Next up, Kendre Miller. Obviously, Alvin Kamara. I think it's a groin injury.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I have not seen for sure that Kamara is or is not playing. Let's just assume he's not because I think we all know the answer if he is. If Alvin Kamara does not play, are we really supposed to throw Kendre Miller into our starting lineups in the semifinals, despite him doing almost nothing for 1 1/4 years, Dalton? 1 3/4 years?
Absolutely not. But I am excited about Kendre Miller, like as a whole picture. And one thing he's done really well is in his start, he has the highest in his game last week. He is the highest of any running back with forced missed tackle and rush yards after contact in a game, which is really impressive. He showed his job.
He has 11 broken tackles on 28 rush attempts this year.
He's been very impressive in limited usage. It does seem that Dennis Allen hated him for whatever reason. But you are starting a time where even AK was a borderline shaky RB1 with this talent he has because that offense is in a pretty dragged state. And it took a Cedric Wilson passing touchdown last week to really make Alvin Kamara's day a good day. Kendre Miller is not getting that kind of looks. He's a good player. He could go off, but the bottom for him is pretty low. And I mean, we haven't even talked about it yet, but they signed a first round pick at running back in Clyde Edwards-Helaire to their practice squad today. So better watch out, buddy.
I think the Saints. Okay, Clay. I think the Saints are just trying to sign every player they possibly can from the Chiefs and hoping it does something for them. I mean, that is, I think, four guys who have been on the Chiefs like within the last 3 or 4 years. Tyrann Mathieu, Colin Saunders, Willie Gay, and now Clyde Edwards-Helaire.
MVS.
Oh my God. MVS has actually done something for them. Yeah, I mean, it's really, really hard to throw him out there. Not because, like, it's all set up really well for him outside of the offense being terrible, right? Like, they have nobody that you should feel threatened by in that backfield. I mean, he outsnapped Jamal Williams 26-6 last week after Alvin Kamara got hurt. You mentioned the stuff, the broken tackles. He grades that really well in a very small sample size on PFF. He's top 5 in the NFL in yak per rush attempt this year. But if you do start him, just know this guy has gotten hurt a lot. Like, anybody can get hurt in the first week or the first quarter of your fantasy playoffs and just completely derail you. But just think about how you feel if a guy who has had at least 2 knee injuries, has had multiple stints on the IR, and has basically had like 3 worthwhile games as an NFL player. Think about how you'd feel if you threw him in there, because again, the profile, just based on the talent and the workload, suggests this guy could really be a smash. But I just can't, like the other backup running backs, the Isaac Guerindos, Jerome Ford, Zach Charbonnet, if he plays, just saw he was not practicing with an oblique injury. So that's great. That's great in Seattle. I trust those guys more than him. And like, not to say I'm seeing anybody say to do this, but I've seen, separate excitement about Kendre Miller. And I've seen questions about, should I bench Joe Mixon this week against the Chiefs? Don't even think about doing something like that, especially both those things combined. Benching Joe Mixon for Kendre Miller, but especially don't bench Joe Mixon, even though it's the Chiefs. But yeah, you will really hate yourself if the Kendre Miller start blows up in your face.
Yeah, and I mean, I think a good comparison to this is Kendre Miller and Ramondre Stevenson are pretty comparable players in a lot of ways, especially in the forced missed tackle. Look at Ramondre Stevenson's season, which has been up and down and hasn't had a really impactful game, to be completely honest, from a fantasy perspective. And then look at the offense he's behind. And it's not a one-to-one comparison, but what Kendre Miller is stepping in is pretty similar to what Ramondre's been dealing with all season. And you're asking a player, one, to hold that lion's share of workload, and 2, to be uber productive for you in it. And those are just bets you probably shouldn't be making at this point in the season.
I mean, I haven't looked, but how many career rushes do we think he has in the NFL? Is it
I know
more?
He had a game with like 25 at like week 18 last year, so he probably has like 45 or so.
I was going to ask if it's more or less than 60.
Oh.
Which is pretty low. I can put this cat down real quick and keep on going. Next man up on the running back. I guess we'll loosely consider Gus Edwards a waiver wire guy, but I'm really kind of using this, Dalton, just to talk about this Chargers backfield as a whole. And I'll tee you right up for this. I mean, your guy, Kamani Vidal, kind of played last week. Not saying you should start him,
but he
played. Not well. Not saying you should start him, but are you buying or selling that Kamani Vidal is one of the main reasons why you should bench Gus Edwards this week?
I mean, he did play a season high 44% of the snaps. He was also involved on third down. He got a couple of targets. A couple of the targets got called back on penalties on the plays, but he did make catches here and there. I mean, like from a dynasty perspective, it's a little exciting to see he's getting a bit of an extended run. From like a real fantasy perspective in this week, he should not be in your considerations. For Gus Edwards, I mean, it's Jover in so many different ways for him. Yeah. If you look at Kyle Borg, who's the chief editor for Fantasy Footballers, he went ahead and listed out every single rush attempt that Gus Edwards has had this year. and he has 2 that are 10 yards or more, 10 and 11 yards. And there's a lot of zeros in there.
Yeah.
Which Gus Edwards prototypically was a player who would get 5 yards carry, and that was perfectly fine. It is the end of Gus Edwards' career. He's been a fine player for that career for what he needed to do, but the Gus bus is breaking down, and the Chargers are definitely not going to be able to rely on that. I think the coaching staff knows that. If you look at pass rate over expectation since J.K. Dobbins has hit IR, the Chargers are top 8 in the league. When before that, they were bottom like 20 in the league. They were super low. They were passing the ball frequently.
It was flipping a little bit, even with Dobbins. They were starting to pass more, but yeah, they definitely have even more since Dobbins got hurt. And I mean, you mentioned Vidal played on third down. He actually played on every third down. He played on 100% of the third downs and got all the running back targets. I mean, Gus Edwards leads the backfield because he plays more snaps and he gets the goal line work, but doesn't catch passes, doesn't ever have a long run. So you're just praying for a touchdown from Gus Edwards. And they play the Broncos, who have given up 5 running back rush touchdowns all year, none since week 9. And that was when Derrick Henry had 2 of those 5 that they've given up this year. So tough defense, cooked player, situation sort of slipping away from him. Don't even think about Gus Edwards, even though I know the Chargers RB1 might be tempting if you're in a bad spot, like at a flex. If you have to flex 1 or 2 guys in your league.
Yeah. And that's where anybody we've mentioned, including Tajay Spears, are more exciting starts.
Yeah.
This would be the absolute funniest outcome to the season if Vidal comes out as the lead running back and also runs all over the Broncos. That's the kind of place we're at in the season, and for that to happen would be hilarious.
How big would that be for you in best ball if Kamani Vidal had like a 20-point game this week?
Well, brother, let me tell you. We are done in best ball. All the teams that I had that advanced I was big into Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley. And that got me somewhere.
I didn't even check to see. I only drafted 1 best ball team this year. I didn't check to see if my team that advanced is still alive.
Yeah, boy, howdy, did those 2 disappoint for everybody they took to the playoffs, because they combined to be like the RB16 in points. And that really killed my entire portfolio, because those were all my advancing teams. And then the one team that I did have a shot with, my starting quarterbacks were Bryce Young, Kirk Cousins, and somebody who's already been benched. Oh, Justin Fields.
This Saquon didn't even score. So my team did not advance. Saquon did not score for me this week at the running back position. Tajay Spears has to be one of the first times he scored for me this year. 24 points. James Conner. And then Travis Etienne scored for me over Saquon this week. I mean, really, it was a Saquon, Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase team, and Burrow and Chase had pretty pedestrian days. Tyler Lockett scored for me. Jacoby
That's
Myers.
Pretty bad.
Yeah, Tyler Lockett had 2.7 points. Wow, 5 points from Dawson Knox. Tight end explosion for me.
Well, I will say part of the reason I made it this far is a lot of my teams that were RB heavy, I did like a hero tight end build with like Travis Kelce or Mark Andrews. And then Jonnu Smith very clearly flexed a lot for me because of the weeks he's been having.
Okay, off of our best ball teams, on to the Tennessee Titans. Speaking of Tajay Spears a minute ago. Will Levis benched for Mason Rudolph. I guess this only makes sense this makes sense from a football perspective, but this only makes sense from a long-term perspective. Like, Will Levis has to be done until, like, you can't bench the guy multiple times in the season and bring him back. Like, you just can't do it. So I've got to think he's done in Tennessee one way or another. We've kind of talked about the running backs, and we know if Pollard plays, we're not starting Tajay Spears. We are starting Tony Pollard, I think, no matter what, if he's active. I mean, does this really do anything to Pollard's rank for you? Because for me, it's more about the health and just he could miss a chunk of the game or just leave the game altogether, which he missed a chunk last week, but I'm not sure the offense will be worse in any meaningful way as far as just moving the ball up and down the field because they're not great with Will Levis.
No, the offense is changing pretty significantly in the sense that the explosives that Will Levis brought to the table are gone, but this offense is going to be a chunky offense that's going to grind it out, and they're going to have longer possessions. And I think the end, because we know Mason Rudolph's QB play isn't great, is still going to be comparable to what you would get with Will Levis. The only difference between the two is that the way you're going to get your points with Mason Rudolph instead of Will Levis is you're going to get like a 7-target game from Calvin Ridley instead of a 4-target game with one long one that blows up for you. So I think the outcome's the same. The way the offense function changes pretty dramatically, but we know the product that Mason Rudolph's going to put on the field, and it's going to be very game manager-esque. He's not going to take chances. He's not going to turn the ball over, and they're going to try to run the ball and play ho-hum football instead of the couple of these deep shots where Will Levis either makes a throw or makes an amazing Twitter clip.
Yeah, I heard the tail end of what you're saying about Ridley specifically, and it's funny. I actually came into this discussion just mentally as I was doing research, thinking, okay, let's look for why I should want to bench Calvin Ridley, because I know Will Levis is not good, but like you said, you do get those chunk plays, you do get those explosives, and Ridley can have his day made in one play, which is a lot less true with Mason Rudolph. I think this week specifically, whether or not you bench Ridley is a lot more actually about the Colts than the quarterback. This is from Jake Seeley on The Athletic. So the Colts run the most zone coverage, 80% rate in the NFL. Calvin Ridley's yards per route run against man are almost 3. His yards per route run against zone, 1.22. And part of that might be because Will Levis, I'm assuming, probably cannot read a zone, which will play a role in that. So I'm not saying like bench Ridley solely because he's playing against team that plays zone coverage. Not saying that, but he does just have, I think, a little bit more risk to his profile this week. If you remember his most infamous game this year, 8 targets, 0 catches, 0 yards. That was against the Colts earlier this year. So that's just a little scary. But then when I just looked at it more from a Mason Rudolph perspective, you look at the 4 games that Rudolph has played and attempted 25 or more passes. Ridley is averaging 8 catches for 75 yards. He doesn't have a touchdown in those games. He has, I would say, 2 pretty solid games, 1 pretty meh game, and then he went 10 for 143 against the Lions with Mason Rudolph at quarterback. So there is upside, and most importantly, there is volume. He has 8 or more catches in 3 of those 4 games. It just comes differently. So the zone stuff does scare me a little bit this week. I do think for sure in championship week, though, maybe even this week too, Ridley does at least get a little bit safer, maybe a little bit less of a play-the-play ceiling, but I mean, it's hard to argue too much of a higher ceiling than 10 for 143 in a game. So I don't know. I think all of that to say Ridley is probably about where he was in your mind before. It's just going to look different, like you kind of said.
Yeah, well, I will say, and I might be speaking out of pocket here. I'm working off of memory, but historically, I believe Calvin Ridley's been better against zone than man, going back to his time in Atlanta and his time in Jacksonville. And I believe his reception perceptions have been more positive for his zone coverages. And I think part of that targets per route run and fantasy points per route run is a defect of Will Levis. I mean, it is clear that he is not a good zone reader. That's probably where most of his interceptions occur. And that the man coverage is probably easier for him to read, especially with Calvin Ridley, who is somebody who can beat corners on those deep routes, which is where he's made his money with Will Levis. So I'd probably say I still feel pretty comfortable, even if the numbers don't suggest Calvin Ridley is going to do well, because I feel like historically he's been pretty good against zone coverages. And I'm assuming you're looking it up right now to tell us on his reception perception.
Yeah, so he's actually he was slightly better against man last year. 69th percentile man, but 65th percentile against zone. So basically the same. I don't know if I can go further back in reception perception, but I can check. But yeah, I think what you're saying does make a lot of sense. When I saw those splits, I was like, oh my God, that is terrifying. And then you combine that with, I know he had 8 targets and 0 catches against this team earlier in the season. But then it's like, well, that was with Will Levis. You have to imagine Will Levis probably, I think one of the main critiques with Will Levis coming out of college, and we've seen it, obvious, like some of the most hilarious screenshots of all time, are because the man cannot process what's going on NFL field. And man coverage, if your guy gets open, it's a lot more straightforward of an answer than zone coverage.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that's where Mason Rudolph is better. He's been in the NFL long enough that he can diagnose the coverages. I just don't think he has the talent to beat them all the time, which is why he's a retread backup.
Yeah. Okay. I can't go back and view 2021 Calvin Ridley, so we'll leave it at that, and we will go to Calvin Ridley's former team. Kirk Cousins is out. The Penix is in. And Michael Penix is
The what is what?
I was very careful with my pronunciation in that sentence. Michael Penix is the new starting quarterback. And first, I just want to say this just kind of brings me back mentally to all those conversations we had. We being us, we being Twitter, the wider NFL media, fans, whatever. And I feel like some people landed on, it's insane. It was actually a good pick by them to draft Penix. And I just want to say, I don't think a lot of people had a problem with drafting Penix, even where they did. I think it's just the combination of you pay a guy $140 million and you draft the quarterback, number 8 overall. And I think you're seeing that right now, where could they just have played him from the start? He would have walked into a really good situation. Who knows what this year would have looked like? And even if the results with Kirk Cousins are great, so either way, I think we were going to be looking at kind of a sunk cost from an asset perspective for the Falcons. And just so happens the way it worked out is that Kirk Cousins, who for a minute there we thought, okay, Kirk, he's cooking again. Last 5 games, 1 touchdown, 9 interceptions. That is just like Johnny level game management. And that is how we're going to know if Johnny listened to the podcast this week. I mean, how this shakes out from a weapons perspective for the Falcons. I mean, I think Bijan is Bijan, right? Like it's like a running back. You're starting him no matter what. Doesn't really, maybe the floor gets a little bit lower because the offense is a little bit less certain. Although the great thing about the Falcons this week is they play the Giants. So if you're going to make the change, this is a pretty ideal matchup to do it in. Kyle Pitts, I think the great thing about Kyle Pitts is he sucks so bad that no one is probably starting him this week. Of course, Kyle Pitts could go off in any week. He absolutely could. But I don't think this is like you should go out and pick up Kyle Pitts off your waivers and throw him in your lineup because the quarterback changed. So really, the question is just Drake London. And I do still think Drake London is a guy that you have to put in your lineup. I just think the ceiling probably stays about the same. The floor just gets a little bit lower. And there's just not much as a fantasy manager you can really do about that. And it's just really hard to know what to expect from a rookie who has not played. And not only has not played, I was really annoyed by this earlier today. They don't do game logs for preseason. Like you can't look at a player. So like I had to go look at individual box scores of 3 preseason games because I was like, I remember that Penix did not play very much in the preseason, but how little did he actually play? He only played the first game. He didn't play the second or third game, which is just really annoying. He has 5 pass attempts in the regular season, so you can't learn anything from anything in the regular season. He did play a fair amount in the first game, but he played with no starters. He didn't play with any of their running. Like, I mean, it's like Jace McClellan, that running back, and nobody I've heard of at wide receiver. I'm sure backup O-line. And the Dolphins, who they were playing no starters, it didn't look like either. So we just have no idea what this is going to look like from the quarterback. But I will say it's been pretty bad for Kirk Cousins to the point where I don't think you should downgrade Drake London too much. I do think Darnell Mooney, who has had a great connection with Drake London, probably goes from usable to I think I'd rather find another option.
Yeah, I think this does hurt out of all the weapons. If you're still starting Kyle Pitts, stop it. And good job making the playoffs and winning your first game. Because that's impressive starting Kyle Pitts.
Does Trejo still start Kyle Pitts in our dynasty league?
No, I believe he started someone else this week. If he
I'm
started
gonna
Kyle
look.
Pitts, that's
If he
hilarious.
starts Kyle Pitts against me, you know that's when you have permission to start Kyle Pitts. Is if he's doing it against me. Oh, Kyle Pitts is in the lineup this week. Who did he start last week? I'll look.
But I think the biggest.
Oh, he started Dalton Schultz last week, but now it's Kyle Pitts time.
I think the person who lost the most from this is Darnell Mooney.
Yeah.
Because Darnell Mooney really fit what Kirk Cousins needed, which is that intermediate, like in breaking and deep routes. And they did have a good connection. I mean, last week it didn't look good for obvious reasons. But throughout the season, Darnell Mooney has been a pleasant surprise in this offense and probably been somebody that people can flex pretty consistently. And I think he's out of your lineup consideration. Please don't get cute with Tyler Algier. It's really
good
Drake
one to bring
London and Bijan, and you start those guys because one, they play the New York Giants, and two, they're good at their position. And if Penix knows what he's doing, it's going to be a lot of Drake London. And the one spin zone I'll place on this one is Michael Penix is old in the sense that, like, I think him and Bo Nix might be close to the same age. And the positive
it was pretty rough for Bo Nix to start the season.
It was, but the one positive we did see from Bo Nix is that he grasped the offense pretty quickly and has turned around his playing. And if Penix has had enough time to sit and learn the offense, there could be some positives there. And
he could come in and play better than Kirk Cousins has played in almost any game outside of the one game where he threw for 500 yards or whatever it was this year. He could do that. Yeah. He absolutely could.
Yeah, Kirk Cousins is just a merchant for the Bucs and Saints, which are bad defenses. And apparently he was throwing piss missiles in practice to start the season, so maybe they're there.
Well, weren't they all in practice?
Yeah, but if you're relying on Drake London to win your matchup, I'm a little sorry because that's going to be a real bumpy ride no matter what until the game starts.
Yeah, it's definitely stressful, but I don't think anything actionable for him. Yeah, a good point to bring up Algier. I don't think you should probably be considering him anyway because you just never know when he's going to score a touchdown. Kind of like Gus Edwards. That's really the only time you can use him is if
he's better than Gus.
He's better than Gus, but just like profile wise, that it kind of is the same. All right, on to Kansas City and Patrick Mahomes. Now, he is injured. It seems like he's going to play. I think it was Ian Rappaport that made the comment in one of his tweets that, like, basically he's not going to be 100%, obviously, but he is probably going to be out there. Or maybe it was, I don't remember who said it, but it was out there, put out there by somebody. So let's be under the assumption that he is going to play, because originally it was like, okay, we have to talk about if Carson Wentz plays, what do we do? I think we can probably...
Yeah, it's been a full participant the last two practices.
Yeah, I think he's going to play. Basically, as soon as he said that this wasn't as bad as the Jags ankle injury, I was like, okay, that means he probably is going to play because he's apparently a freak of nature when it comes to ankle injuries. But even so, Chiefs offense obviously has not exactly been a fantasy goldmine. If he plays and is not at 100%, not at 100% mobility, most importantly, playing a good defensive line in Houston, what are you doing with your Chiefs this week, Dalton?
I mean, this one is difficult. Like I said earlier, I have Travis Kelce as my tight end in the semifinals matchup, and I have Jonnu Smith, who has been flexing. My other options are really Jalen Coker and Tajay
just got an 85-yard touchdown. Wow, why are we not starting him?
So you have to start Travis Kelce.
Yeah, just because of the position. And even somebody like me who has Noah Gray also on the same team as Travis Kelce, I understand it is very frustrating to watch Noah Gray score 13 points and Travis Kelce score 6 points like it has happened a lot lately.
But
Kelsey
to
only
that
has
point,
Kelsey only
Travis
has one
Kelce
touchdown. I have to
is
believe he's scoring again.
well, he's first among tight ends in red zone targets
Yeah,
and
it
like
just
18th
hasn't.
in touchdowns.
He has one touchdown this year.
Yeah.
One.
So you have to expect the positive regression hits there. This feels like a Travis Kelce game because Houston does such a good job at generating pressure and they have good outside corners that you really think that this is going to be a lot of getting the ball out quickly and in the middle, which is where Travis Kelce's game is best utilized. Now,
Yeah, and I mean in the playoff game against Jacksonville, when Mahomes got hurt and it was Henny for a series, and then Mahomes came back in severely limited. Obviously, different offense, different team, all of that. Kelsey was younger, but it was let's hit the Kelsey button because Patrick can't move, and it is possible we see that this week.
yeah. Well, the second thing I'll say about this is, I mean, Hollywood Brown might play, which
Yeah, and that throws a
makes
wrench into things too.
it makes things weirder, especially for the wide receiver conversation with Hopkins, Worthy, and Brown starting, which is why I really want to stay away from all three of them because I just don't know what his role is going to be, where he's going to play, and who's going to move where. I feel like the one solid we can count on is that Travis Kelce will still get his work, and that the Chiefs really want to win this game so they can lock up the bye as quickly as possible. So I think Travis Kelce is probably the main option. Pacheco, I don't feel great about, but
I think Pacheco is probably like low end RB2, high end
Yeah.
RB3 type
Yeah.
of guy this week.
But really, I think it's just Kelce that I'm trusting to start, and the rest of them, Hollywood Brown, I wouldn't start at all if you held on to him.
No.
Hopkins, I think, is a good flex appeal, and Worthy, I'm also not starting because I think Brown most likely hurts Worthy's production.
Yeah, and it's possible Hollywood could play, but I mean, it's his first game back. We've seen a million times for the Chiefs in a first game where a guy goes out there and plays 20% of the snaps. We've also
So
seen
please don't be the guy who tweets Hollywood Brown was on the first play of the field.
Alert. And it's also like Tyreek Hill has in the past come back and immediately been Tyreek Hill. Possible Hollywood Brown comes in and immediately is really good. This is also his first game with the team, period, which kind of throws a bigger wrench into things, obviously, even though he did have a full off season with Mahomes to actually work. So he should have, I would think, some grasp on the offense. What will be really interesting, what if Hollywood goes like, well, number one, what if they actually hit a deep target and it's to Hollywood Brown, which I do think if they're going to hit deep shots, even though like Worthy is a guy, like Worthy and Mahomes clearly are not on the same page as far as like depth, when the break off, just like, they have not been on the same page all year.
Yeah, Worthy's second in the league in uncatchable air yards. At 44% of his air yards are uncatchable.
What's going to be really interesting is what if Hollywood goes like 3 for 100 and scores a touchdown, and it's like, do we start Hollywood Brown in our championship week? But to keep the focus on this week, I do think that D-Hop is a guy that is very much in that flex range, like you said. Like I think you're probably, if you've been starting him, you're probably still just throwing him out there, even if Hollywood Brown does play this week, because like I said, you just have no idea what his role or snaps or anything will look like. He could literally get out there for 10 snaps and it wouldn't surprise me. Or he could play, 50% of the snaps and it wouldn't surprise me either.
And I just think the Hollywood role impacts what Worthy's been doing a lot more than what D-Hop is doing.
Yeah.
Hollywood provides that downfield man-beating coverage we want, and this version of DeAndre Hopkins is very much more of a zone beater, knows where to float, and I think that is a better matchup against this Texans defense than anybody who's trying to beat Derek Stingley in man coverage this year.
Yeah, for sure. And I do think this can be seen as a positive for this specific situation and also a negative for the season as a whole, because you want Hopkins to be out there playing more and producing more. But on the positive side this week, it's not like, oh, Hollywood's back. Hopkins, if he goes from a 90% player to a 60% player, I can't start him. He's pretty much been a 50, 60% snap guy at best the whole time he's been here. And he's been around a 17% target share most weeks. He's been over 20 twice. He was 24% in that Chargers game in Arrowhead a couple weeks ago. And
that Chargers defense does have a lot of similarities to the way the Texans
Yeah.
defense is. Strong pass rush, good at takeaways, heavy man team.
Yeah, and I mean, I think part of it, we've seen this a lot from the Chiefs. Like, they may be trying to manage a Fed and get into the playoffs. Also, you can correct me if I'm wrong, if you know. I think there is some draft pick compensation tied to percentage of snaps played for Hopkins for the Chiefs. I'd have to go look, but I think that might be the case. So there could be some shenanigans going on there.
I'm not sure about that one, but I wouldn't put it past the front office.
But I think the backfield is really the toughest call right now because, like I said, you're starting Kelsey. I do think you're starting Hopkins, and you're letting Worthy sit. And obviously, if Hollywood plays, I'm not throwing him out there. The backfield is tough because this is as true a 50-50 split as you can get. There's not one guy who is clearly the short yardage guy. Pacheco got his chances. Hunt has got his chances. I think it should be Hunt. Hunt is better at than Pacheco, but we don't have really any clarity on who it's going to be in a given game. Both guys have gotten similar receiving work, which is to say neither has gotten very much, but both of them are getting a little bit to amount to a normal amount of receiving work. Also, Samaje Perine is involved in the passing game too and has given the Chiefs a couple good plays here and there. And then like both have gotten goal line or like red zone type of opportunities too. So I really think it's just Pacheco is the more explosive player. So you're starting Pacheco, and Hunt is more kind of the desperation RB4, low end RB3 type of dart throw, similar to the Gus Edwards of he has to score a touchdown for me this week.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good read on the situation.
Anything else, Dalton, you want to add? Oh, no, wait. This is a short topic, but just something I did want to touch on before we jump out of here. Obviously, the Lions lose David Montgomery, as you mentioned off the top, out for the season. So big blow for them, as we must do here. We look to fantasy. This is obviously you're starting Jahmyr Gibbs no matter what. You were before, you are now. But I am just curious, how many guys are you ranking ahead of Jahmyr Gibbs for these next 2 weeks?
Oh, maybe Saquon.
I think my answer is 0. I think Jahmyr Gibbs is the RB1 for me the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, and I mean, I would fault you for that one at all. Saquon does get Dallas week 17, which is fun. Jahmyr gets the Niners, but
they get the Niners this week, I think, right? This week.
I'll
pull it up.
No, they have Chicago this week.
Oh, Chicago this week. So I don't think Chicago's
terrible run defense. They gave they gave the Vikings their first ever second half running back touchdown to Aaron Jones a couple weeks ago.
Gibbs had over 100 yards against the Bears earlier this year. I know that much. I mean, okay. So one thing, the part of the reason why I wanted to bring this up, if he does not become like Christian McCaffrey for the next 2 weeks, and for the real life playoffs, I don't want this to somehow turn into a negative Jahmyr Gibbs conversation, because yes, we did just see him once Montgomery went out. He went off last week, like played a season high in snaps, had almost 30 points. I think he ran a season high 46% of the team's total routes, which is like, if you get running back doing that's pretty great. The thing you have to keep in mind is the Lions do not get in trail game scripts very often. They were in that situation last week. That's part of like any questions about Amon-Ra St. Brown, the player. I think you can put the rest if you had them just as a fantasy producer, because what has happened this year is a lot not in his control. The team is too good. They have not had to have these games where he has 15 targets, but when it's needed, he can go whatever it was, 11 for 150 and a touchdown. And by the way, had food poisoning, threw up before like the day before the game, and still went out there and did that, which is just crazy. So anyway, bringing that back to Gibbs, I just want to say, like, if Gibbs is not absolutely going, like getting all of this receiving work, don't say, oh, like he just doesn't have that kind of workload in him. he may not be needed to have as big a workload as he had after Montgomery went down last week. With that said, he will probably take, I would say, a small step up in the total volume, probably, that he was getting with Montgomery in the backfield. And they were splitting the red zone work. It just seemed like each guy was kind of getting a drive, and whoever was in the game would get the red zone carries. I would have to think that Gibbs would be trusted more in the red zone than whoever's, now the RB2 there. So I think those are where the upgrades are. And I'm just trying to get ahead of Jameer Gibbs didn't have 28 points per game when David Montgomery went down. So I just don't know if this guy's as good as we thought. Like, no, we've seen it with our own eyes all year. This guy is as good as we thought.
Get ready to learn Sion Viaki, buddy. About to take over that backfield.
Oh my God, that is a hell of a name. I would never have pulled that one.
Pretty sure he's converted safety to running back too. He used to play at Utah. That is who the backup is, by the way, for anybody wondering why I'm just dropping random names. No, I mean, I think Jameer Gibbs is going to be a stud rest of the season. It'd be really hard for him not to do that. And the only thing I will say getting ahead of this is let's not get crazy next year and people start ranking him 1 overall.
Yeah, I agree with that too. If he does go off and go crazy, which he very well could, and if he does have 26 touches a game for the next month, let's not project that into next year, unless, of course, there are longer-term concerns with Montgomery and the recovery off of the knee surgery. I'm trying to pull this up right now. Did you see what Jameer Gibbs' Christmas gift idea was for Dan Campbell? Of course, this link is really slow.
No,
load.
I didn't.
Oh my God. And it's not going to load. Oh, here we go. Let's see. Jameer Gibbs. Oh, he wants to get him a bone, like a dog bone for Christmas.
God.
So if you don't think Dan Campbell's going to let that guy get at least another couple extra carries in the red zone, you've got another thing coming. On that note, Dalton, that is going to do it for episode 165 of the Half Point Per Podcast. As I said earlier, it will not be the usual time next week. Wednesday at 7:00 next week will be Christmas, so we will not be recording a show then. We'll figure something out, get you an abbreviated show next week. Give us a follow on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. We will keep you updated on Twitter as far as that goes. Half Point Per Podcast. Subscribe to the YouTube Half Point Per Podcast as well. The link to all of those things will be in the show notes as always. Leave us a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you again next week.